Let's talk about some of the problems we run into when we read historical fiction. In this video and the next, I'd like to talk about some of the problems we run into when we read historical fiction. They're problems that both readers and writers of historical fiction face. It's helpful to start with a definition of what historical fiction is. So, according to the Historical Novel Society, yes, there is such a thing, the definition of historical fiction is fiction that takes place at least 50 years in the past or was written by someone who didn't directly experience that period in history and therefore who approaches it through research only. So that puts into the category of historical fiction some novels that maybe we don't necessarily think of traditionally as historical fiction. One example would be Charles Dickens' novel A Tale of Two Cities, which is about the French Revolution in the late 18th century, but which was actually written in the 19th century. One of the real problems that readers run into with historical fiction is trying to discern where the line is between the fact and the fiction. But I would argue there isn't really so much a line as a continuum when it comes to historical fiction. And I think it's more helpful to think of it in that way. Where on the continuum does the book that you're reading fall? So on one end of that continuum, we have a book that's been heavily researched and hews very closely to the facts as we know them. And on the other end, we have something that we would call alt history, which I'll get to in a minute. A book like Sally Cabot's book, Benjamin Franklin's Bastard, falls on the end of the continuum that's very close to the facts as we know them. So Cabot heavily researched this book. In fact, when I saw her speak at a book event in one of my local bookstores, she talked about the exhaustive research she did on Benjamin Franklin because she didn't want to get anything wrong. So what she's doing in this novel is filling in the gaps in the historical record about a woman with whom Benjamin Franklin had a son, a bastard son, whom he did claim and take care of for his whole life, but about whose mother we know very little. So Cabot, in writing this novel, is imagining the life of that woman and filling in the story of how Franklin met her, who she was, how the child was born, and so forth. On the other end of the continuum, we have alt history, alternative history. And all alt history begins with a premise that is known to be not historically correct. So a couple of examples of alt history novels would be a book called The Guns of the South by a writer named Harry Turtledove, who imagines what would happen if rebels showed up in the Civil War South with AK-47s. Another example of alt history would be Philip Roth's book, The Plot Against America, in which he imagines what would have happened if Charles Lindbergh had defeated FDR in the 1940 presidential election on the eve of World War II. I think in some ways historians find the alt history a little bit less troubling, interestingly enough, because everybody understands that the premise is not historically accurate. Whereas any other kind of historical fiction farther along the continuum becomes a little bit more muddy, and it's hard to know, again, where that line is between the fact and the fiction. A lot of novels fall somewhere in the middle of that continuum, so Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall would be an example of one of those. Mantel is telling the story of Thomas Cromwell during the reign of King Henry VIII, and she plays pretty fast and loose with the facts. In fact, she's been criticized about doing that in both this book and its sequels. But the fact is, it's such great fiction, we don't really care. I like what the historical novelist Tim Weed has to say about this issue. He writes, "Here's the thing about writing historical fiction. You're not trying to reconstruct or mimic history, which would be altogether boring even if it weren't impossible. What you're trying to do is to create a new version of it that will tell a good story while simultaneously capturing something essential, not only about the period, but also about contemporary life." So, what does all of this mean for us as readers? Well, a couple of things. First of all, a reminder of what we already know, that reading historical fiction isn't the same as reading history, and we have to be careful not to succumb to the temptation of thinking that we're learning our history from historical fiction. Second of all, I think it's helpful to know that there's a continuum, to think of it in that way, and to ask yourself, where on this continuum does the book fall that you're reading right now? I think that may be able to help you parse out where the fact in the fiction intersect in the novel, and to what extent one or the other of them takes precedence. The next time you're reading a historical novel with your book club, think about this continuum. It might bring an interesting new facet to your conversation about the book and where it falls on that continuum. In my next video, I'll be addressing another problem we commonly run into when we're reading historical fiction, which is how to separate the past from the present. Read on!